Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Creating a Mutually Rewarding Apprenticeship Experience, Understanding New Farmer Typologies and Skill Acquisition. The webinar is brought to you today by the National Ag Apprenticeship Learning Network, which is a project of the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project. And we're so excited to have Leslie Forsat and Abby Sadakis with us today. Leslie works with the University of Maine Cooperative Extension, and Abby is a farmer, project manager, and Land for Good field agent. And they'll be talking to us a little bit today about some of the interpersonal skills for rich learning relationships in mentorship programs. So we are looking forward to hearing from them. And before we get started, I want to go through a little bit of the technology related to your participation in the webinar today. So as you may have noticed, all participants were muted upon entry, and you'll remain this way throughout the duration of the webinar, largely to reduce background noise. What this means is that if you have a question, we would prefer that you type it in via the chat box. The chat box can be accessed by moving your cursor to the top of your screen. A menu bar will come down and you'll see the little familiar chat bubble. So throughout Leslie and Abby's presentation, if you have a question, please feel free to enter it there. And there'll be points throughout the presentation where we can stop and ask questions. And then, of course, we'll have the opportunity to answer questions at the end as well. If you are joining by phone, I don't believe you have access to the chat box. And what we can do in that case is if you have a question, just make note of it and we can distribute it after the webinar via email. So with that in mind, we'll go ahead and get started. Before we move to Leslie and Abby, I do want to tell you a little bit about my work and the work of the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project. So my name is Brianna Bowman, and I'm the National Farmer Training Networks Manager at New Entry. New Entry is a farmer training organization that has been active in Massachusetts since 1998. And we've grown from our roots as an incubator farm to now provide aggregation and distribution services through a food hub, as well as larger beginning farmer learning network resources throughout Massachusetts, and to host a number of national programs, of which the Agricultural Apprenticeship Learning Network is one. Some of the other national work we do includes support for incubator farms through the National Incubator Farm Training Initiative. And we also provide support to applicants and grantees of the Community Food Projects Program and the Beginning Farmer, Rancher, and Development Program. For information on any of our programs, you are welcome to visit our website, which is nesfp.org. Today, I want to talk a little bit more about the Ag Apprenticeship Learning Network before we get started. So the network is geared towards the sharing and development of best practices for meeting the learning goals of ag apprentices looking to gain management and production skills on commercial farms. What this looks like is really a lot of support for mentor farmers. So we work to facilitate communication and relationship building among ag mentors and to develop resources and training based on the network members' interests and needs. Currently, the ways to engage with the network include adding yourself to the map, which you'll receive a link to in a follow-up email from this webinar and is hosted on New Entry's website. You can join our listserv, which is where you can ask questions about topics like the ones we'll discuss today, or any topic related to mentoring an ag apprentice on your farm. We also distribute an annual survey, which we encourage you to take next year, which will allow you to report on your operation as well as any training needs that you may have. Again, you can stay tuned for new resources from the Ag Apprenticeship Learning Network and a resource library that we're currently building out, which will serve to aggregate existing resources available to mentor farmers. And then in the coming years, we do look forward to expanding into being able to offer technical assistance and regional trainings. And if you're on the listserv, you'll be the first to know about these. Those will be regionally specific trainings made available to ag mentors throughout the United States in partnership with our core partners on this project. I do want to take a moment to talk a little bit about our kind of hallmark resource that we put out recently, the Ag Apprenticeship Toolkit. So working with our core partners that I mentioned earlier, which include the Dairy Grazing Apprenticeship, Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, Quivira Coalition, Rogue Farm Corps, and Velicus Training Institute. We put out the Ag Apprenticeship Toolkit, which is a comprehensive guide to developing or improving an ag apprenticeship training program on your farm or ranch. And this is really about soup to nuts, from the inception of the idea to start an ag apprenticeship program all the way through some of the ideas for evaluating the program and suggestions for curriculum, as well as specific tools and questions that can help you along the way. I'll include a link to this resource in the follow-up email as well. I'm really excited about how the work of Abby and Leslie enriches some of the work that's in this toolkit already. We know that relationships are central to the apprenticeship work that many of you are doing, and so we're excited to learn how to make mentorship both rewarding for the mentor and mentee. So with that, I'm going to pass over the mic to Abby and Leslie, and we'll get started.
Good afternoon. This is Leslie, and I'd like to introduce myself. Welcome to our presentation today. We're excited to be talking with you. I do work for Cooperative Extension. My content area is human development. I'm a specialist at the university. I conduct educational programs and research about farm and family balance, communication skills, and stress reduction. And on this grant, I've been a project leader assisting with the research and documentation to create a DACUM for beginning Maine farmers and a beginning farmer learning stages document. I'm Abby Sadowskis, and I've been the project manager for supporting relationships for farm success. I also am a farmer. I operate Apple Creek Farm LLC, which is a certified organic, diversified livestock operation in Bodenham, Maine. And I am recently become a field agent for Land for Good. So I am also really excited to talk to you today about our project and how we believe the skills that we're going to talk about can really help you with farmer apprentices or trainees. The project itself is supported by a 2016 Professional Development Program grant from Northeast NESARE, and the purpose of our project was to support a variety of relationships for farm success. So that would include spouses, employees, apprentices, and family members, everyone that is involved in the success of a farm. And as well, the Beginning Farmer Resource Network of Maine was a huge sponsor, and a lot of the ag service providers that are part of the network were part of our project. The BFRN was founded in 2012, and the advisory council includes members of more than 20 organizations that help support beginning farmers in a variety of ways. As Bree mentioned, there are going to be multiple opportunities throughout this presentation. Just a little housekeeping. There will be opportunities to put questions into the chat box, and she will help collate those, and we will be able to respond to your questions during the presentation, so you don't need to save everything into the end. So one more piece about the project is our performance target. With the project for developing relationships, we aimed to educate 45 agricultural service providers to increase their competence and confidence to understand and respond to beginning farmer concerns about interpersonal relationships. So we were really focused on ag service providers, and what we've learned is very applicable to what you're doing in the apprenticeship world in trying to work with aspiring farmers. So as part of the project, we met with a variety of farmers in focus groups, and we heard from the farmers that interpersonal issues arise and that they could use support in addressing these issues. We also know from these conversations that farmers often cited popular media, such as the Farmer to Farmer podcast, as a place where they heard other people talking about these issues. But we know that not everyone feels comfortable going to a service provider and saying, hey, we're not very good at communication on our farm. How can you help us with that? So in your work with aspiring farmers, we hope that using these tools will help you be more comfortable discussing these issues, and that will in turn help the next generation of farmers feel comfortable talking about them as well. As we start to introduce the communication skills that we hope to increase everyone's skills in. We hope to take you on a journey from unconscious incompetence to unconscious competence. So we hope that you'll gain a new perspective and tools that will help deepen your understanding of apprentices and the trainees that you're working with. So this is not a seamless process, because part of this is starting to understand what you don't know, which is considered unconscious incompetence. So right now, there are things that you may not be aware of that you don't know. So we'd like to bring you to the point of conscious incompetence, where you're aware of what you don't know, so that then you can practice what you don't know and start to become competent, to the point eventually when you are unconsciously putting into place the skills that you've learned. So active listening is one example of that. Active listening may or may not be something that you've heard of. It might be something that you may or may not do, but we're going to talk about it to get it to the point where, and then you'll be able to practice it to get it to the point where it's just something that you do automatically. The specific skills that we're talking about with respect to interpersonal skills are communication. They're all sort of these non-technical skills. So communication and decision-making and goal setting and time management. We're going to continue to loop back to these because they're the focus of the project. And we saw that communication, decision-making, goal setting, and time management are often at the heart of many technical issues. We'll be applying that in different ways throughout the presentation. So who's responsible for decision-making? What are the relationships and roles? How are people communicating? Are people actually setting goals? And does the lack of goal setting or does the lack of time management, is that what's getting in the way of implementing something new or having a farm enterprise work smoothly? And that could be true with the same question about issues that might be coming up in being a mentor farmer. So the aim of our project was to develop first a better understanding of who new farmers are. And we know that new farmers, according to the USDA, are anyone in the first 10 years of farming. And that could be a variety of types of people. So we don't make any assumptions about who a new farmer is. But we also know that just knowing the years of experience farming is not an inclusive description of who someone is and what skills they bring into their farming venture. So the Northeast New Farmer Network, which is the NESARE, created a typology for new farmers that had years associated with 6 types of farmers, and they grouped them into prospective, beginning, and then years were associated with each type. So if you were just thinking about farming, you were considered a prospective farmer. If you were actually starting to get into farming, you were a startup. There was a whole different typology of people at different years that were engaged in farming. So we took on that typology, and then we started to talk about it with respect to the interpersonal skills from the previous slide. So how are relational skills present at each stage of farming? So in the beginning, and when someone's prospective, or in the beginning, or in the middle when they're re-strategizing, or at the end. But what happened is when we started to meet with actual farmers and with ag service providers, they said, this doesn't make any sense to have it tagged to years of experience, because people are coming into farming perhaps with a whole host of other careers behind them if they're second career farmers, or different types of work experience or personal experience that they're bringing into farming. So we kind of got away from this non-linear idea of that there are years associated with levels of experience. But we do think that a stage framework can be a useful way to think about farming. So to have a stage framework or a typology. So we looked at other existing farming ways that other existing, like the Rogue Farm Corps has a typology as well. And most of these, the way that the typologies are used are to design curricula. So the program Exploring the Small Farm Dream is designed for someone who's in a specific learning stage of being an explorer, or people that are interested in farming but may not have experience. And there are different resources that are available and skills checklists that people can use at different stages of experience. So how we started to apply this was our own farmer typology that includes developmental stages of farmers, the developmental cycle, and then learning stages. So the type of farmer is considered a unique combination of their level of farming experience, where they are in their personal and business development, and then the learning stage of the farmer. And again, we're thinking learning stages not of the technical aspects of farming, but of relational skills like communication, decision-making, goal setting, and time management. How much experience has an individual had at putting those skills into practice? So this three-legged stool that we have up here, each of the legs provides a new insight about the potential needs of a farmer and opportunities to explore with oneself as a mentor and also with apprentices to understand how skills related to communication, goal setting, and the others can impact the farm's future success. So we have a nice diagram here of how this farm development stages work. And again, when you look at some of the resources, you'll see that there are years tagged to like what a prospective farmer looks like, or a startup farmer, or a refining farmer. And we've pulled those years out so that it's not quite as linear and boxed in, and people might fall into it at different times year-wise. So it's an approximate trajectory. So we researched a variety of education programs. So Angelic Organics has one, New England Small Farm Institute. And then we worked with our ag service providers in Maine to come to consensus on what developmental stages make sense. So again, this is an approximate trajectory for farmers, so you can see when someone's coming in as an apprentice where they might fall. So are they considering agriculture as a career? Are they investigating it? Are they actively committed and engaged in training and planning, at which point, when we talk about goal setting and decision making, they've already put some of that into place. But it's not limited to the first 10 years of farming. So depending on an individual's farmer development, a new farmer in their business might be in the startup phase for a really long time. They could then likewise an apprentice or a farm worker, so someone that you're working with, they might be prospective farmers for a really long time, traveling from farm to farm, testing out where they want to be once they set up their own farm to develop all their skills and interests that can be used in the next stage of farmer development. So thinking about how these stages occur in an apprentice situation, you can think of an apprentice who's in their late 20s to early 30s, who's deciding to explore farming. They might approach it as a career change, and they see apprenticeship as a low risk way to test out farming and spending the summer in a beautiful place. So as you, as a mentor, interact with that person, you can really start to think about their commitment and competency and their developmental stage, and you can start to frame the questions around how your training is going to be focused with them. So if their goal is to become a farmer, what skills and resources are going to be beneficial to them? And then how does your program work to move them from explorers, where they're just getting into it and they're not sure what they're going to do, into the actual startup phase? This is an opportunity now to ask any questions that you might have so far. Just type them into the chat box. I'm going to take this time to ask Abby a question. So in your experience, do people ever get in over their heads in apprenticeships? So when you look back at like prospective farmers before you own land and you're farming independently, like are folks ever in over their heads as apprentices? Do they know what they're getting into?
I think there's a lot of individualization that happens. So the number of people coming into it is super varied, from the folks who are, just sort of considering the idea of becoming a farmer to those who are pretty intent on becoming a farmer and this is their first step. So I think, setting up the context of figuring out where this person, what their level of commitment is, what their level of interest is, that makes it quite different.
I can imagine that the goal setting would look really different for someone who has no idea what they want to do at the end of it, compared to someone who comes in as an apprentice and says, this is what I want to learn because I want to go do this in 3 years.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think that, in the same way we showed that slide of the unconscious incompetence, there's a lot of notions about what becoming an apprentice is, and depending on where folks come from, they may not have a clear idea of what a farm looks like. So the idea they may have in their mind might be out of sync when they were out at your farm. So all of those pieces can sort of cause them to act in particular ways once they get started with their apprentice training.
Bree, did any questions come up for us?
Not seeing any questions yet.
Okay. Okay, so
we do just one comment quickly. Someone's mentioning that it's a little hard to hear, so if you could speak up a bit, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thinking back to that three-legged stool, so we have the stages, which is where is someone in their personal journey to becoming a farmer, to something that we're calling the farmer development cycle. So this is really based on models of human development and thinking about typical experiences during a life. And then we also looked at the business development cycle, which wound up having some really nice parallels. And this is a figure and a comparison that's side by side to explain that. So there's a seed, a launch, a startup, an expansion, a maturity, and a transition that happens in our personal lives and in our business development. So when we think about adult learners, and this is part of actually that Ag Apprenticeship Toolkit that Bree mentioned earlier. There's some very nice written chapters in there that can be very useful in thinking about how you're designing and implementing your apprenticeship program. So in talking about adult learners, they really want to be self-directed. They want to use their life experience and their pre-existing knowledge, and they want the learning to be relevant and practical and delivered in a way that they feel respected for the age that they are and the experience that they bring. So in the human life cycle, ages 0 to 18 are a time for personal development and for the individual within the context of a larger system. And then from 18 onwards, you're growing and the person's becoming more individuated with a greater sense of self and personal preferences. And then we start to move into partnership, which is considered to be expanding, and people individually expand in different ways, whether it's team building and romantic partnerships, or marriage and possibly children, and or an expanded social network. And then in maturity, the person sustains and reaches a level of productivity. So if we think about our life's development, and we think about how we are designing an apprenticeship program, there are multiple layers of this. One has to think about, where am I as a farmer in my own personal development, and where is my business in development, and then how do I share that with a mentor, with a mentee rather. So how do you share it with the apprentices that are coming to your farm? Where are they coming to you? Are they in their own personal startup phase? Have they already had a career and they're coming in a little bit more mature? So we really take this kind of human development approach and looking at you as a mentor to think about where you are with the skills that you're bringing to your apprenticeship program, and then also thinking about the apprentices. And by taking human development into account, it helps increase and improve communication.
So here are some examples. It might be useful to consider how formative experiences, such as growing up on a farm, can influence the farmer's thinking and approach. So this could be how, if you grew up on a farm and now you're taking on apprentices, what are the pieces of your thinking that come back to those formative experiences? If you're sort of seed and launch, so growing up before you were 18, were informed by farming, you may be in a very different place when you're considering land acquisition for a farm when compared to someone who grew up in an urban environment and has discovered agriculture after a summer of kind of a summer apprenticeship. So in thinking about that, you may prioritize skills on your farm because you grew up on a farm and say, these are the things that I really want my apprentices to know. And what you may want to do is consider are those really the key skills they need, or is that because of how you grew up and how you approached farming? So thinking back on the example of the apprentices in their late 20s or 30s, what experiences have they had that shaped their approach to farming and their interpersonal skills? So this might include where they grew up. It might include jobs they worked during the summer, whether they started working at 16 as soon as they were able to, or perhaps they didn't have their first job until after they graduated college. Those work experiences are obviously relevant to their readiness to become a farmer or become a good apprentice, but they may also have helped them develop skills that include time management or the ability to make decisions under pressure or present their feelings with clarity. If they haven't developed those skills, and one way we're going to talk more about how to ask and inquire, if not, the skills that you see that are lacking can be modeled on your farm. So thinking about how you approach orientation, your farm training, the feedback loop that you create, all of that can reflect these factors.
So at this point, we've introduced you to two of the legs of the three-legged stool and the different communication skills that we're talking about, or the interpersonal skills, including communication, decision-making, goal setting, and time management, as integral to how your farm is operating, how your apprenticeship program is operating, and what your apprentices bring into the apprenticeship experience. So the opportunity to put in a question, and I have a question for Abby about your farm. So how long has it existed, and how do you think, when you think about you and your farm partner, where are you guys in that farm development cycle? What do you guys each bring to the farm that was informed by your early experiences? And when you think about that diagram, how does that play out?
Sure. So my partner and I started farming together in 2011. In 2014, we moved our business to the farm where my partner grew up. So we had been farming in two different locations, and we moved everything to the farm where his parents still live, and where we, what we call the home farm. So we're in pretty different places in the development cycle in terms of our business. I came to farming through a job at a large nonprofit that runs farmer training programs. And so I have been teaching business planning to other farmers since 2013. So I look at our business with our big picture goals in mind, on the 50-year plan. My partner, by contrast, also often sees the work on the day-to-day level. So he's our project manager, and so he really sees that to-do list first. So we do our financial planning together, and then it's my job to monitor our sales and expenses through the season. So I came to the farm having run my own business prior to that. It was a smaller scale, and my partner grew up on the farm, and so his perspective of farming wasn't based around a business. So that has been a real kind of reconciliation process, is trying to think about the farm as a business and look at those expenses rather than sort of embedding them into the farm culture or lifestyle. So our business training differs pretty substantially, and because my partner grew up on the farm, he also has a different sense of what's needed on the farm. So he has a lot more useful skills to apply to the day-to-day operation and thinks very concretely. So as I mentioned, that to-do list. I see our farm from a perspective of efficiency based on our farm goals. So I'm always looking at, here's where we want to go, and this is what we need to change on the day-to-day basis. So where that sort of is out of sync is my partner has been informed by the past, and in some cases has a sense of, we've always done it this way. So I think that is a really good example of how someone who grew up on a farm has a different sense than someone like me who didn't grow up on a farm, but had a sense of where we want the farm to go.
Well, and I could see both of you coming into, back up a number of years, and if you were going to become apprentices or something, that each of you would have very different kinds of questions that you would have, ways that you might ask those questions, again, goals that you might have set. And so that would really, you can just start to see how this fleshes out when you're starting to design your apprenticeship program, why it's important to really understand who is coming to you, so what their skill sets already are, and then knowing your own communication style, decision-making style, how you set goals, and how you manage time, so that you're aware of what you're teaching. Yeah, because if you guys, and then as business partners, if you guys have different decision-making styles, then that's really going to affect the apprentices that come onto your farm if you're doing something. So yeah, it's very rich for, I wish we were in more of a conversational type of setting than a webinar, because a lot of this is thinking about your personal experiences and being able to kind of brainstorm and reflect on who you are, who your farmers are, yeah, and how this all plays out. Because we're coming to the third leg of the stool now. Bree, were there any questions that came in the box?
Yeah, I have a question actually. I'm wondering if there are any like common assumptions that you see mentor farmers making, either about apprentices that are coming to work on their farms, or potentially about just like next generation. If any of those assumptions surfaced during any of the like focus groups that you did.
Yeah, there were a couple. So one of those is the notion of what a millennial is. And I think that one way to look at that is some of those definitions take everybody from, I think, 1980 through like 2001. And I was born in 1980, and I don't consider myself a millennial. So I think that that's one really easy example of really, it's easier to talk about people in a group, right? And sort of say, well, millennials have different ways of interacting with people because they have grown up with technology. And some aspects of that are true. And I think also there's the piece I guess we heard a lot of farmers talk about was how once they started talking in those terms, so they sort of said like it's the millennials, then when they started sort of winnowing it down, it was really a how you set the expectations at the start of the apprenticeship. So a lot of the folks mentioned things like using the internet, having the internet at all times, having access to their cell phone as being very problematic issues or symptoms of this changing expectation. And so I guess that would be one that comes to mind really easily for me is having I guess setting out what you think you're going to get, and then coming up with ways that you're going to address those potential problems within your training before they even happen. So that could be your orientation manual. That could be in the conversations you have with hiring people. I think that what we're going to go through with the typology could give people really interesting and different ways to ask questions during that interview process to find out if the people that they're looking to recruit, who of them is going to be a really good fit for their farm.
Which is a really nice segue into the third leg of our stool, which thinks about the learning stages of an individual. So this model illustrates a level of skill and competence in relationship to a task or enterprise. So the learning stages range from novice to expert, and these stages are based on what's called the Dreyfus model of skill acquisition. And that was a tool that was sent out in the original email kind of promotion for this webinar. And the Dreyfus model, I think, has really broad implications for both farmer mentors and how we contextualize new farmer behavior and learning styles. So as we look at the learning stages, the place to start is with our 4 skill areas: communication, decision-making, goal-setting, and time management. And thinking about, as you sort of look down the list, there's some shorthand explanations of each stage. But I'm going to go through what the Dreyfus model says about each stage. So a novice has an incomplete understanding of the whole context of the task they're being asked to do. So they do tasks instantly without conscious thought of decision or decision. So if you give the novice a to-do list,
That's one really simple way to communicate what your expectations for the jobs they will complete. And they will do those tasks, literally. And they're not going to think about, you know, it says on here I should transplant today, but it's super sunny outside. Maybe I should ask if today is the best day to do this. They don't have the framework in which to make that judgment call or question your decision. So one of the ways I think about this is if people remember the childhood book character Amelia Bedelia, her bosses asked her to make a date cake in one of the books. So she snipped off dates on a calendar and she put those slips of paper into a cake batter and she made a date cake because she didn't know what a date was. She didn't know that it was a, piece of fruit. So that's a kind of hilarious way to look at what a novice has. And, I think that a lot of the apprentices that come to farms, it's easy sometimes to make assumptions that they know more because they maybe had a previous farm experience. But because we know that every farm is sort of its own unique ecosystem, I think it might be better to think that this person is a novice in many ways and create the context for them to show you that they're not actually. So an advanced beginner has a working understanding. They tend to see their actions in a series of steps, and they can complete simpler tasks without supervision. So I think the part I want to focus on in terms of farmer training is they tend to see their actions as a series of steps. So again, they may be able to see how their season on a mixed veg operation might go from crop plan to starting seeds to transplanting to maybe direct seeding alongside transplanting to thinning, bunching, harvesting, wash, pack. But they may not. They may only understand what they've seen on another farm or what they've read about. So I think helping them gain context and sort of say, here's what your job is, and here are all the different parts of your job, and here is how our training is going to show you how to go from starting seeds all the way up to thinning those seeds in the field and then cultivating them, harvesting them, and storing them for the season. So again, thinking through stepwise, your training will be really important for both novices and advanced beginners. Someone who is competent has a good working knowledge and a good background understanding of the field they're working in. So they can see their actions at least partially in context. Now, not always. They can work independently and to a standard that's acceptable, but it might need refinement. So we're going to touch on this a little bit later. Someone who's proficient, they really understand the whole system, not just the job they're working on. They can see how their actions relate to the other, they have implications for other pieces of that whole system, and they can achieve a high standard routinely. And an expert has an authoritative or deep understanding. They deal with routine matters intuitively, so their decision-making process is no longer sort of on display. And they're able to go beyond existing interpretation. So that might mean they're really open to experimentation. They might conduct on-farm research, and they achieve excellence with ease.
Can I throw just a quick comment in that there's no assumption made that as a mentor farmer, you're an expert. That's not an assumption. You may be anywhere on this continuum with any particular skill technically or the communication skills that we're discussing.
So what does this look like in real life? So here's an example I put together based on how I use a tractor. And this is I think a good one because it's hopefully one that's very concrete and realistic for you. So after the winter, which we're coming up on the end of our winter, we hope, I rarely operate a tractor in the winter, and so I need a refresher on some aspects of each of our 5 tractors. If I forget a step in starting a tractor, for instance, opening the fuel line or putting in first gear, I may need a reminder on how to solve that problem. So the tractor won't start. What do? I have to think back through what I know. And some of that is, one, sort of being calm, and 2, it is sort of having the presence of mind to remember that you've done this before, and you just need to sort of go back through that muscle memory, perhaps. By contrast, during the haying season, when I'm on a tractor really frequently, I still need reminders when we change fields. So we hay, about 10 different fields, and we do most of those fields only once a year. So I need a reminder on, in this field, you want to be in this gear, and you want to see the attack at this number. I need a reminder about how to optimize the way the field's been raked. And I'm not yet an expert because I haven't been able to use the tractor without thinking through the controls and also the potential hazards. So I ask you to think about this example when you consider the tools your trainees are going to use. What's your expectation of their skill level at the start of the season, midway through the season, and at the end of the season? Is it going to be enough that they're competent? And as we recall from the previous slide, that competent person can work pretty much independently into a standard that's acceptable, though they aren't going to be really refined in the way they use things. Or would you rather have someone who's really proficient? If so, how do you explain these expectations, again, through that job description, your training manual, your feedback, and that, sort of the feedback is the ongoing refinement. And how are you going to provide the feedback they need to get them to the place where you need them to be for your farm to be running efficiently? So I want to take this. We're showing you a lot of the models that we came up with as we combined these different frameworks for understanding skill acquisition. So the next model is going to be more pointed to our 4 skill areas.
So when we now move our skill acquisition, which is moving from novice to advanced beginner to competent to proficient to expert, when we think about the 4 different areas of interpersonal skills, the time management, the goal setting, the decision making, the communication, we chose a circular model to really get away from any notion of linearity that seemed to be really confusing and not applicable when we were digging into how skill development around goal setting worked, how skill development around time management worked, and decision making and communication. So we think of this as really a nested model where a novice knows a certain amount of information. So it's like the rings of a tree. The farmer is building skills starting off as a novice, and then they move out as more skills are developed. So in time management, you may have no formal experience doing anything with time management. You might not know any of the systems related to time management. You start out as a novice. Then once you've learned a little bit, you build on top of that, moving into advanced beginner, then competence, then proficiency, and eventually expertise, where you're automatically just implementing your systems. So there's another resource available to you in Chapter 3 of the Ag Apprentice Handbook, where there are a list of questions where you can start to think about yourself. So thinking about your readiness to be a mentor. And we would invite you to expand the types of questions that you ask to these interpersonal skills. So do you know the difference between short and long-term goals? Do you understand the way decisions will be made on your farm? Are there areas of communication where you need support? And then all of these questions are then going to get asked of your apprentices. So will they understand the difference between short and long-term goals? Will they understand the way decisions are made on your farm? And are there areas of communication where they might need support?
So this type of self-assessment can be done at any time. And one of the ways to look at this is sort of what's called a spider map. So you put different plots down to indicate the level of skill you have in each of these areas. So this example with the red dots is mine. So communication is one where I feel like I'm pretty effective in a variety of situations. I'm pretty good on the fly, but I also need to be reminded that what I'm saying is also what I'm doing. So if I were to be in a teaching situation, I'm pretty good at being on the fly and sort of saying, this is what you need to do. But can I do that again later, the next season, or the next time that same teaching moment comes up? I'm not sure. I'm improving my skills in active listening and facilitation in order to have difficult conversations more easily.
So you've kind of placed yourself on the rings here between competence and proficiency.
Yes.
For communication.
Yep. In terms of decision making, my partner and I don't always have the easiest time making decisions. We've developed a system looking at sort of all the asks in a given week, and at our Sunday morning farm meeting, we decide who will complete those jobs. So we say, you know, we've been asked to do this and this and this. Which of those opportunities do we want to take up, and how are we going to decide who's going to take on all the different projects that we have going on? So who's going to call the electrician, who's going to build a hoop house, and by when do we need it done? And this one I'm rating myself between advanced, beginner, and competent because we haven't locked in a system for doing this.
And is this something that like your partner could do too, kind of a spider mappy sort of thing? So his skill, his spider map might look completely different, which helps you understand where you complement each other.
Yep.
And same with this could be a self-assessment for an apprentice.
Yep, exactly. For our goals, those are pretty well considered. Our farm, we use holistic management, so we've taken the time and written our 3-part holistic goal together. That also does help us in our decision making because we can use the holistic goal to test our business decision and help us keep sight of the big picture. So that big picture for us is our 50-year plan, as I mentioned. That keeps us from feeling rushed and has helped us become better at planning. So I think that is just one example. Oh, sorry. And then in terms of time, I think like most people in this day and age, I never feel like I have enough time. I work at an off-farm job, and I'm active on a variety of boards in our community. And this is one area where our goals, which are, getting rooted in the community, and for myself, not growing up there, really wanting to feel like I'm part of the community, it feels a little bit out of alignment right now with the realities of running the farm. So, that is one where I gave myself kind of a less than, a less than competent rating, because I feel like there are still, and I think another easy way to look at this too is that novice and advanced beginners up to competent, you're looking at a variety of different ways, some tools to help you. So this might be a calendar, this might be a daily planner, it might be, some type of, a lot of the farmers in our focus group talked about online to-do apps and things like that. So the mechanics of it also indicate a level of skill acquisition, because the more skilled you are at something, the less of those tools you might need to use. Or you may just have them really integrated.
I want to pause for a second and just, if there's any questions, please type them in the box. We don't have an official slide to put up about that, but type them in the box and Bria let us know, and then we're going to share a little bit more skill development stuff with you.
Okay. All right. So one of the resources that we also mentioned in the initial offering is the New England Small Farm Institute's Design a Curriculum, or the DACUM. And it's a tool that was created by Ohio State University to outline occupational profiles for the purpose of establishing peer-developed standards in a particular industry. So this project happened in the early 2000s, and it helped design a DACUM for a successful, sustainable farmer in the Northeast. And it includes a list of duties and tasks that these successful farmers do. And more background information on the DACUM is available in the Ag Apprenticeship Toolkit. But what we want to talk about is how the DACUM can help mentors define and map the overall Ag Apprenticeship curricula and goals. It's up to the mentor to break down the components of each task into sort of bite-sized pieces, or figure out ways where that particular component is going to be taught, and then again that context is going to be built around it. So it's helpful to be aware of the 4 relational skills communication, decision-making, goal setting, and time management for yourself, because these skills become part of the dynamic of the training. They're not, one of the things we looked at is how those relational skills are not explicitly included in the DACUM, yet they sort of underpin all of the success of running an operation of this sort. So when you're looking at those skills and how they become part of this, you're going to have to be, as you would with teaching someone how to use a wheel hoe, you're going to need to be thinking about how do I demonstrate for them a really productive way to communicate around difference, or how I want to do something, and how to communicate that different emotion, those types of things we'll get into. So the DACUM is a really useful tool to understand the steps to establishing a successful, sustainable farm. So it's broken up into these different parts, and the goal of building this was to develop a competency-based training model. And so it does that in that it breaks up all of these stages, or all these duties that one would need to do to establish a farm. But it doesn't necessarily give you any of the how underneath that. And we're going to look at the whole thing, and then we're going to look at what's highlighted here, which is duty F, manage farm labor resources. And I think one of the challenges we saw with this is that in order to be a successful farmer, it implies that you have competency in every one of these equally. So you're as good at planning your whole farm as you are in raising livestock or raising crops. And we know, because farmers sort of pick up skills as they need them, that isn't always the case. Okay? So again, as Leslie said, we're not assuming as a mentor farmer you have expertise in every single one of these areas, nor are we saying that a successful farm would have the same level of competency in all of these areas. So I want to put that out there, because I think one of the pieces we saw with this is the expectation that that was the case, and that in putting the DACUM with all of these tasks next to that farmer learning stages, is that by following this plan, you were guaranteed to have this great farm. And I think that the reality is that everyone's going to go through this and touch on each one of these in a different way, as suits their personality, as suits their strengths and weaknesses, and as suits, your market and the physicality of where you're farming. So we're going to dig into one section of the DACUM, and I'm going to provide some examples of how our 4 skill areas are implicated. So just to read off what's there, the DACUM lists 14 duties, which are A through M, and each of these duties has 10 to 12 tasks underneath them. So breaking the learning trajectory up in this way can be really helpful, as we mentioned, and it can also help you do a self-assessment. So again, Chapter 3 of the Ag Apprenticeship Toolkit has that mentor self-assessment. And it can also help you to think about how a skill assessment might be useful for your trainees. The structure, as I mentioned, the structure of the DACUM implies there's a linear method or trajectory to building the necessary skills to become a successful farmer. We know that isn't reality. And as we mentioned, someone could be really proficient at production methods and still a novice at marketing skills while still maintaining a successful business. And I think what we looked at was how particularly in cases where farmers are re-strategizing, so they're looking at where they need strength in different areas, say their markets change, say their family goals change, having a sense of how the interpersonal skill areas create a buffer around what could be difficulties, whether they're financial difficulties or interpersonal difficulties, can be really valuable. So we're going to look at duty F, managing farm labor resources. We just chose this one because we think there's a lot of good ways to talk about our skill areas in it. And we're going to talk in particular about 3 of the 11 tasks. So we're going to talk about F2, which is reading job descriptions, and they say that those should be clear and comprehensive. We're going to talk about conducting a farm orientation, which they mentioned should cover health and safety issues and quote where things are. And then we're also going to talk about training farm workers in field work, efficiency, and equipment safety. So first we're going to talk about creating job descriptions. So underneath this, we have some of the project areas, how they're implicated in the success of creating job descriptions. So what we did was we took the DACUM and we essentially added what we thought were novice and advanced beginner skills in order to support what was the DACUM, which is a competent or proficient farmer. So the first one we put on here is goal setting. So in thinking about how your goals relate to your core needs, how would you describe your farm goals? What are your goals for labor? Is it because you want to have more efficiency? Is it because you need to increase production or want to increase production? Or are you really focused on educating the next generation of farmers? And how are those personal goals going to be fulfilled by training new farmers or by mentoring? Is it going to be because they're going to share responsibilities, that they're going to help you be able to focus on the work you really enjoy and do some of the other stuff that you would rather not do? Is it going to be a nice way to have some work-life balance? What is it that has pushed you to think about doing training for new farmers? Under decision making, so have you developed a production plan that indicates when you'll need labor and for how long? So again, we're looking at a competent or proficient farmer looks at managing labor and says, okay, I need to create a job description. Now, how do I do that? And what we're saying is that you need to have some of these goals developed so you know why and how this person's going to fit into your operation. You need to have some tools to have made decisions about when to hire this person. And then as we get down farther, do you have the time to really sit down and develop a clear job description? What kind of time management skills are implicated in just this one process? And then communication. This job description is the first place where you're going to be putting out a clear set of expectations. And that, in doing so, it can eliminate disagreement because the roles and the goals are clear from the start. So the next one is conducting on-farm orientation. And so in the DACUM, they describe that as covering health and safety issues and sort of where things are. So in order to fulfill this duty, a farmer needs to have a certain number of skills here. And the first one we're looking at is communication. How are your intentions clear for this conversation? How are you orienting new trainees? And that can be part of it is verbal. So what are you telling them? What have you written down in your farm manual? And then what does your body language say when these folks show up? All those pieces should kind of be thought through as you bring someone onto your farm.
I have a question. So when we think about the DACUM and it breaks down all of these skills, there's nothing in that about how you would communicate? Like, is that, so that's where the novelty of this project comes in, and what we're trying to show is that the DACUM tells you some duties and some tasks, but it doesn't really tell you the how as a human being to kind of have the rubber meet the road around like what's involved in the personal side of having an orientation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. So
this is really helpful.
Communication is I think one of the easier ones to think about. One of the others is time management. So thinking through, as Leslie said, where the rubber meets the road, are you going to orient all of your apprentices on the same day? So that, again, means in your job description, you say everybody starts on June 1st. How are you going to carve out time to have that initial orientation? So we put in here, how are you going to plan to reduce distractions? So that might mean, your children go to a sitter, or you have other folks on your farm team who are going to handle the day-to-day operations that day. And how are you going to not only just get the training done, but also how are you going to layer on that context to reinforce these initial conversations? Because again, we think back to what a novice is doing, they're going to hear all the things you're saying. So you're going to say, here's the wash pack shed, and here are signs to remind you of where things go, and here's field 1. But in what ways are you going to create kind of a trail of breadcrumbs to remind them of those things? And then also, is your farm orientation going to refer back to your apprentice manual, where you're going to have a field layout and you're going to have a layout of the farm so people know, oh, right, I went by the wash pack shed, and then field 1 was on the left of the wash pack shed, right? So helping them build that context, that whole picture of your farm. So along with communication, awareness of timing with beginning and introducing the conversation, talking a little bit about how you're going to communicate on a daily basis, and then maybe modeling that through your orientation. The last one on this one is decision making. So how does your farm orientation reinforce what is outlined in the job description? Does your manual address how and when skill development will happen in all areas of the job description? So those are decisions you want to make ahead of time so that you can sort of have all these pieces fall into place. So task 8 is train farm workers. So again, we're going to go back to that example I talked about. What's your goal in training? Do you want a competent staff that has a good working understanding and sees their actions in context and is able to complete work independently? Or do you need proficiency, which has the added value of a deeper understanding of how the completion of a task to a high standard supports the farm as a whole? So I think this is really, part of it is setting yourself up for success, and setting up apprentices for success will really help you set those goals and help you communicate those goals to the apprentices. By 1 month in, we need you doing X, Y, and Z, and we're going to help you get there. So having regular check-ins with yourself and others is a great time to evaluate competency and skill. Was the job completed to the standard you set? What needs refinement by your apprentices, or what needs refinement in your method of teaching? So I think it's really helpful to remember that at certain times, it may not be the best time to talk about something, but as a group, you could talk about it in your morning meeting, in one of those regularly scheduled check-ins. And that might mean as you monitor how things are going, you plan something you hadn't necessarily thought you'd have to do. So that might mean taking the whole crew out and going through working that wheel hoe, so that everyone understands what you're asking. One of the, if people don't feel like this is an area where they can use more support, there is a tool on the project page of our website, which it's called the Eisenhower box, and it's a way to keep track of how you decided to use your time that day. So it answers decision making and time management. And then you want to really anticipate the time needed for you and your farm managers, not just for the initial work with, but also the feedback and refinement components of working with apprentices. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box now.
I'm thinking about that DACUM, which is a really complex document to start once you start looking at it, and really also very worthwhile to start digging into. So one question that I have for you, so sometimes that I've heard farmers might be concerned about like the speed of an apprentice, that apprentices are slow, or I've also heard apprentices don't listen. What's your experience like with that? Have you managed employees, or have you found good ways to improve communication?
I think a lot about that example of Amelia Bedelia. And so we work with, our primary point where we work with employees is on our hay crew. And so when we're on the wagon with them, we're giving them instructions about how we're going to stack hay. We're also going to be on the wagon with them. So we're going to monitor how they're stacking and correct that right away. But I think the important thing to remember is that, or what we remember, is that the next time they get on that wagon, we're still going to need to go through that monitor and feedback every time. Because, again, until they understand they've done it enough times to have the muscle memory, they're not going to remember that we always stack, 5 across the bottom and then 6 flat on top of that. So I think that remembering, don't assume because you told someone how it was done once that they're going to get it, or that they don't assume they read that apprentice orientation guide that you put together. Think about ways to ask them to check and make sure that that happens. Okay. Any questions?
Yeah, there's one question about tips on incorporating this knowledge and tools in an environment with heavy language barriers.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So I think one of those pieces is kind of coming up with ways that I think feel comfortable to do that feedback and refinement. Because that is certainly an issue. A lot of this is reliant on verbal communication, but I think that you may also want to construe that as how do different people learn, right? So if you're taking away the ability to use language, then there's going to be a lot of body language and facial cues. And so in terms of teaching, that means kind of mentally preparing yourself to go through and sort of say, I'm holding it like this. Here's how I'm holding it. Here's how I'm pushing it. See how my body is doing this. More gesturing.
And certainly this is also where we think about adult learning theory and people really kind of being the experts of aspects of their own experience. So how can this be addressed sort of on the front end in conversation or orientation when you're having a conversation perhaps that could have a translator present if that would be useful, or certainly you're not in the thick of the work at the moment, to try to come up with a plan of here's a potential scenario that might happen. What's the best way for you to communicate with me if you have a question, or for me to communicate with you if I see that something might be dangerous? So how can you kind of anticipate, and you could probably do this based on your experience judging by the question, how can you anticipate what some of the issues are going to be and actually have that conversation with the individuals or the crew on the front end to come up with a plan that everybody feels good about when you're actually in the field needing to apply it?
And I actually have another question. So it strikes me that a lot of the skills in the DACUM are pretty easily recorded as learned once they're demonstrated. Like once an apprentice is able to demonstrate that they can do it independently with competency. But some of the skills, like the interpersonal skills that you're talking about, could potentially be more difficult to observe an apprentice demonstrating those skills, or observe I guess when you're making an effort to advance one of these skill areas and probably taking stock of when you're using them. But I'm wondering if you could say anything about kind of how to register or keep track of skill development in the interpersonal areas that you're talking about.
So this is one of the project features that we haven't finished yet, but it's basically that nested model, and within each area we identified basic skills within that. So the outcome of that will be something that is as cumbersome as the DACUM, that one could sort of walk themselves through to say, here's where I fit in terms of decision making. Here's where I could rate myself in terms of time management.
Just that it's partially, this is kind of like a self-assessment process. So knowing your own, sort of where you place yourself in terms of competence in each of those areas, and then being able to have effective conversations about that with your apprentices. So we're going to move into an active listening sort of description of active listening next. And that can be, once you feel like you get better at that, you'll be able to have better conversations when there's a conflict arising that might be from someone else's difficulty around communication, if that makes sense. So you start to become more attuned to your own skill level, and that would come out in self-assessment. And then you can also be more useful to apprentices that might have challenges in different ways, or certainly you become better at having a conversation with them about their own self-assessment.
Mm. Great, thank you.
Yeah. So really quickly, this is just a self-reflective opportunity to think about who's been a guide for you in your becoming a farmer or an ag service provider, if that's who you are today. And then what are the characteristics of a good guide? Because apprentices and farm trainees are coming to you for your expertise. And we're curious about the qualities of a good guide. One of the things that came up when we talked with ag service providers, because that's the group that we were working with, about what makes a good guide, is that experts don't always come across as experts. That's not necessarily the way they portray themselves. That, in fact, effective guides are really good at listening. So they might be experts, but they're very, very good at listening. So in an active listening situation, someone who's a guide, so if you think back on who really mentored you, they probably listened to you about the questions that you had, about the insecurities that you were having, about the moments that you are really proud of. So they listen and they give you their full attention. And when you develop the skill of being a good guide and being able to actively listen, you want to hear why this person is coming to you. Like what's really the question that they're trying to ask.
So one of the first ways to think about this is depicted in this tool called the ladder of inference. So the ladder of inference it illustrates the thinking that's ingrained in us and how we can react in a split second and come to a conclusion about a situation. So we have an example here for you on the slide, and using what you want to think about is how to use the farmer typology to get more data about the situation before you apply meaning, before you make assumptions, and before you act on those assumptions. So thinking back on that question of, who are some of the people that people are seeing come in, and they're millennials. So the observable data there is that they're young. You're adding meaning by saying, well, they're a millennial, and that comes with this whole kind of baggage that you're packing up in the assumption. And then you're taking actions based on that assumption. So what we're thinking and what we're going to talk a little bit about is how to walk back down the ladder of inference. So how to take yourself from the place where you've made this assumption that someone doesn't maybe care about their job to what have you observed? And then what are you going to, how are you going to build out those observations by collecting more data through a conversation?
So one of the resources that you'll have access to later is active listening tips and tips for acting as a guide. And we encourage you to keep that guide on hand in a handy location so that you'll be able to have conversations. And so thinking now about this ladder of inference where we all do it, we see a behavior and we automatically add meaning to it. By learning to ask an open-ended question, you stop at what you observed and you can ask a question about it. So rather than jumping all the way up the ladder of inference to assuming someone doesn't care about their work, by asking a question like, I see that you have your phone out. That's an observation, and you can ask a question about that. Is there something that you're looking at? Then they might be able to come back and say, well, actually, yeah, I was Googling how to whatever the thing might be that they, in fact, could be asking you about, that then you can have a conversation about. And you can see that we go up the ladder of inference all the time, and we go from, instead of observable data and asking a question about it, we go ahead and we make lots and lots of assumptions.
Okay, so as we mentioned, being an effective guide is being an active listener. And one of the ways to be an active listener is to engage with the questions. So open-ended questions are a great example. We're going to run through some tips really fast, and then Bree is also going to send you a tip sheet. One of the things about changing the way you ask questions is that I find myself having to stop and reformulate, and that's okay. As you stop and reformulate, you'll start to develop habits where you'll start with an open-ended question. So by asking the apprentice to tell you how, you're helping them share something with you about their experiences and their perspective. Prompts like, tell me more about da-da-da-da-da can be very useful. So some of these are also in the Apprenticeship Toolkit on page 72. And as I said, you'll also have our handout. So the next one is to clarify. So sometimes when someone comes to you with a really kind of emotional request or question or concern, it really helps to ask them some clarifying questions so you understand the full context of what they're asking you. So that might also help them calm down by asking them to take you through the sequence of events that led them to this point. It also can really be helpful in asking, how did you reach this conclusion? How did we get to this point? Which again is a way to clear up misunderstandings around timeline, actions that could have complicated the problem, and or who else is involved. So understanding emotions has to do with naming, because the speaker might need more time. This might come into play when there are differences in language. So you can ask open-ended questions. How do you feel about the situation? Getting people to name what their experiences are, and again, what your observations are. I see that you're upset about something. You look like you might be frustrated. Can you tell me what you might be feeling? And while it might be awkward to name the feelings in the room, it can also build a rapport and provide some insights about the values of you and your apprentices. Other active listening tips that you'll get on our tip sheet, summarizing what someone is coming to you with, what I've heard so far, what I heard you say was, let's recap. So a couple of words and phrases to avoid. One is why. So asking why something happened or why a particular decision can be made is super tempting, right? Because you're being really direct. You're getting to the heart of the matter. However, it is generally really easy to get your back up when someone asks you why you did something. So instead, try how. So again, how did you reach the conclusion it was a great idea to do X? How did you interpret what I told you on the to-do list? Any number of things like that. So, you know, asking if your instructions were unclear, for instance, asking why may just escalate the situation because that person's immediately going to go into this long-winded defensive of how they interpreted your instructions. And that's really not going to help solve the problem. To get to the root of the cause, it may be more helpful to ask how they reached the conclusion so that their thinking is a little bit more apparent to you. Likewise, I think we all understand the idea that putting but in the middle of a sentence really undermines what happened before that word was used. These phrases are also really good at drawing attention back to you as the listener. And in active listening, the goal is to have the attention remain with the speaker. So where you might normally use but, try using and. So there's an example at the bottom. And remember too that phrases like could or would can be taken as kind of cajoling. You know, you're guiding an apprentice to the solutions that already work for them. So asking them to could you or would you do something is sort of a way where you're pushing them in this direction where it may be more helpful to ask them to consider what they're doing a little bit differently. And then in terms of feedback, so I know that this is a really important one with working with anyone, where you're really trying to run your business based on the effectiveness of that person's behavior. So thinking back on where we talked about qualities of good guide, before you offer feedback, think about, are you guiding this person, or are you eager to offer feedback that feels important to you? Or are you being kind of picky? So one of the pieces might be is now, so some of those clarifying questions you might want to ask at the start of feedback is, if you notice there's a problem with something, ask, how can I be better at explaining this? How can I help you improve your technique? And then with feedback, consider your timing. It's not always the best time to go into the feedback mode. You might be hot, you might be feeling time pressure. You may also want to consider, does this problem need to be addressed right now? A big one is, are you clear about your intentions for the conversation? So you really want to understand what their perspective is, or is this, something that's been so egregious that really you just want this person to get off your farm? And if you're not sure, do you have the time to be thoughtful about your approach to the conversation?
So certainly sometimes safety, or if something's time sensitive, you might need to give feedback immediately. But taking a moment to pause and decide, is this the best time to have this conversation, can be really beneficial for really future productivity on the farm.
Mm-hmm. And also considering whether you need to talk to this person as an individual, or if this seems to be something more addressed to the group, as a way to structure that feedback. So if you decide that now is the time to give that feedback, here's some suggestions. You don't need to talk about every aspect of this person's behavior and or actions that you want to address. You want to pick a couple of the most important ones. You want to prepare your thoughts, maybe take some notes. Again, you can use these prompts to help you get to the questions you really want to ask. If it makes sense, if this person is someone you want to make the investment in and you're really committed, you want to keep it positive and focus on improvement. So that's a really great place to add that "and" in. And this may mean that you're taking on additional work to help this person get to the place you want them to be, or what they have expressed they want to be. So we just want to, if you have questions about this final active listening component, if you have questions, you can type those into the chat box now. And we know that was sort of a speedy run through. So we also want to share that there's additional resources on our project page.
Certainly the Ag Toolkit that Bree put up in the beginning has a number of resources, and then our project at the university, these are all resources that were compiled for purposes of this project as well. How to use I statements. You will be receiving a tip sheet about acting like, how to act as a guide. And are there any questions or thoughts about this last portion?
Yeah, we have a question on some of the different approaches or skills that you mentioned being particularly corresponding to the different farmer typologies that you mentioned. Have you seen a relationship between emphasizing any of these skills, or really having to focus on these skills based on the stage of the farmers that people are working with?
Absolutely. And I think that partially some of your orientation in getting to know the person and finding out what skill set they're bringing in, and even so getting at some of this communication stuff, like, how do you like to receive feedback? If the person is someone in there who's a mid-career, doing a mid-career switch, and they have a background where they've either, some people come to you with a background actually in human resources and know a lot of the stuff already, so they have a pretty good sense of who they are, but also they've been in positions where they've received lots of feedback, and they may know that they would really like things written down, or they'd like to talk to you once a week, or they'd like to talk to you at the end of the day, or that depending on where people are at, and again, talking to them about their own self-assessment can be really useful. So not making assumptions about the learning curve of a novice, even though you can have a sense of what their skill set is. You don't know the learning curve of that individual. Have anything to add to that?
Great. We don't have any other questions in the chat box now. One, appreciation for the feedback tips is something that could be useful both with family and apprentices, so definitely a pretty universal skill.
Yes, definitely. And I would say, you know, these I find really helpful to try and, you know, having that, having to think about it before you speak. I'm a very quick-witted, quippy type of person. And I farm with my partner and live next door to my in-laws who also help us on the farm a lot. And so it does really help to frame questions like, you know, can you tell me how you thought we would be able to do all of this today, rather than why do we plan all of this stuff today? Really kind of changes the tenor of a conversation. So, and I think that as farmers, I think that it's really challenging to have one set of skills that you feel like are only for farming, and how we really need to be thinking about this in terms of how these skills do apply all across the board.
And that actually makes me think about another publication that we didn't put up here under communication, which is about appreciation and expressing appreciation. It's part of a series that we have at Extension that was specifically designed around farm families and expressing appreciation to one another, but certainly does not go unnoticed and unappreciated to be appreciated as an apprentice and as a farmer. So you can go a long way by starting with an opening that's of gratitude. Speaking of which, thank you. We really appreciated the opportunity to talk to you all today, and we welcome opportunities to do so in the future. So if you want to send us an email, we'd be happy to answer any other questions or engage in conversation about any of this stuff.
And all of that also to say that this is, we threw a lot of resources at you in a very short amount of time. So as we mentioned, the Ag Apprenticeship Toolkit is a great resource, and there are also resources on our project page. Some of those were designed by farmers specifically for helping, in order to help other farmers with these 4 skill areas. And thanks for Jennifer Hashley to asking us to present to this group, and for Bree for running the board today.
Well, thanks so much, Leslie and Abby. I look forward to stories from the field over the coming season about how some of these skills have been able to be put to use for good, and we appreciate all your work on this. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. We'll send a follow-up evaluation as soon as the webinar recording is uploaded to our site. Thanks so much.